Good day and welcome to the Heritage Minute Special Podcast. I'm your host, Lieutenant Colonel retired Steve Simon, USAFA class of 1977. Today is a different type of episode as I will not have a guest. The topic will be Founders Day, events that led up to that day, as well as some history as to how that one specific date became the Academy's official anniversary. 1 April 1954 is considered the Academy's birthday, the beginning of its distinguished history of achievement and contributions to the nation. On that momentous day, of course, with prominent congressional and Air Force leaders looking on, President Dwight Eisenhower signed Public Law 325, 83rd Congress, Second Session, formally authorizing the establishment of the United States Air Force Academy. While that event marked the beginning of the Academy, it actually marked the successful culmination of decades of planning and advocacy. Indeed, many of the most important events in Air Force Academy history occurred prior to its official founding, a period I like to call its prehistory. The notion of an Air Academy for the United States dates back almost to aviation's infancy. Shortly after the Wright brothers' historic first powered flight on 17 December 1903, Army officers saw the value of military aviation and began contemplating an Air Force and an Air Academy. In August 1909, the Army purchased its first airplane, Signal Corps Aeroplane No. 1, the Wright Model B. Not long after, forward-thinking Army officers were musing aloud about the need for an Air Academy. Lieutenant Colonel A.J. Hanlon wrote in a 26 November 1918 letter, quote, "As the military and naval academies are the backbone of the Army and Navy, so must the Aeronautical Academy be the backbone of the Air Service. No service can flourish without some such institution to inculcate into its embryonic officers love of country, proper conception of duty, and highest regard for honor." End quote. In the next few months, other officials, to include Brigadier General Billy Mitchell, the namesake of the Academy's dining hall, Lieutenant Colonel Barton Yount, and Lieutenant Colonel William Sherman issued supportive memos that fleshed out details of the curriculum and purpose of the Academy. One of the most contentious arguments in the early days was how much flying training would be included in the program. Some wanted Academy graduates to be fully trained pilots, while others believed the institution should provide military instruction and an academic education, while flying training would take place elsewhere. Another controversial issue was where the school would be located. It didn't take long for communities to offer themselves up as the ideal setting for the school. In 1919, Austin, San Antonio, and Dayton were all mentioned, with countless other locations around the nation vying for attention. On 28 July 1919, California Congressman Charles Curry introduced legislation to establish an Air Academy. Congressman Fiorello LaGuardia of New York, he of airport fame, was an enthusiastic supporter, and he conducted hearings. While true believers found the case for the institution compelling, their enthusiasm was not widespread. Disputes over cost, operation, curriculum, location, and other matters abounded, and the legislative effort failed. Essentially, the concept was too new, with too many unanswered questions. Also, post-World War I isolationism kept the concept from generating any serious momentum. While there was little enthusiasm for an academy, its advocates, a decided minority, never stopped trying to convince the Army and the Congress of the need. As you can imagine if you know anything about him, General Mitchell was one of the most persistent and influential advocates. He testified on 31 January 1925 that it was, quote, "most essential to have an Air Academy to form the basis for the permanent backbone of your air service and to attend to the organizational part of it, very much in the same way that West Point does for the Army or the Naval Academy does for the Navy." End quote. Ultimately, Mitchell's impassioned advocacy did not turn the debate, nor did the 1926 name change from Army Air Service to Army Air Corps. aviation still enjoyed less prestige than the infantry. Despite the opposition, the value of military aviation was becoming more and more evident. The Army established flight training bases throughout the country, none more famous than Randolph Air Force Base in San Antonio. It became known as West Point of the Air. This marketing ploy would help San Antonio officials stake the city's claim as the most appropriate home for the academy. In the meantime, the real West Point was resistant to the growing reality of aviation. It wasn't until 1936 that the military academy finally began to provide aviation training. Air Power's pivotal role in World War II rekindled support for an academy, though several of the questions previously asked had yet to be satisfactorily answered. Still, members of Congress introduced a flurry of bills, at least 9 of them in the late 1940s alone, several in hopes of ensuring that the school would be located in their districts. Despite this high-level interest, disagreement regarding the need for an academy and the form it would take, not to mention its service parochialism, continued to doom the concept. The fortunes of academy advocates gained substantial momentum when the National Security Act of 1947 created an independent Air Force. On 18 September 1947, the United States Air Force began operation as a separate service on equal footing with the Army and the Navy. While this was a positive development for academy proponents, the idea took a while to work its way to the proverbial front burner. There were countless other matters of higher priority to resolve first. In the interim, the Air Force's first Secretary, W. Stuart Symington, was successful in negotiating an agreement that West Point and Annapolis would provide 25% of each class's graduates, provided they were volunteers, to the Air Force. This agreement provided the new service with a host of high-quality leaders who would become instrumental in the early successes of the Air Force. However, Symington saw this arrangement as only a short-term fix. Disagreements between the services prompted Secretary of Defense James Forrestal in March 1949 to establish the Service Academy Board to study all academy-related matters and make recommendations regarding junior officer education and training. The board, co-chaired by Colorado University President Dr. Robert Stearns and Columbia President and retired Army General Dwight Eisenhower, recommended, quote, that an Air Force Academy should be established without delay and that appropriate legislation to accomplish this purpose, including the authorization of interim plans, should be obtained. End of quote. So there was a flurry of activity within the Air Force to promote and plan for an academy. Air Force Chief of Staff General Hoyt S. Vandenberg, namesake of the Academy's original cadet dormitory, advocated a more hands-on approach to reviewing and recommending legislation. The Air Training Command prepared a detailed outline for an academy program. In 1948, another board, this one chaired by Air Force Vice Chief General Muir S. Fairchild, namesake of the Academy Academic Building, made 2 key recommendations: that the Academy should be established with a 5-year course of instruction, and that the course of instruction should not include pilot training. As legislative efforts appeared to gain momentum, in December 1949, General Vandenberg recalled Lieutenant General Hubert R. Harmon, namesake of the Academy Administration Building, from retirement and tapped him to head the newly established Office of Special Assistant for Air Force Academy Matters. What looked like quick and sure passage of Academy establishing legislation was delayed again. In fact, each year of the early 1950s by, among other things, the Korean War, conflict within the Department of Defense and Congress, and some of the same issues that had dogged the project since its inception. Frustration grew to the point that some Air Force leaders advocated the unilateral establishment of an experimental academy without the approval of Congress. Finally, in May 1953, House Armed Services Committee Chairman Dewey Short of Missouri introduced House Resolution 5337, a bill, quote, to provide for the establishment of a United States Air Force Academy, end of quote. Hearings were postponed until early the following year, but the concept finally had the momentum necessary to carry it to passage on 29 March 1954. President Eisenhower signed the bill into law 2 days later. That, of course, was 1 April 1954. Perhaps because of the daunting task of designing, building, and opening an academy, and then relocating it from Denver to the still under construction Colorado Springs site, little attention was paid to the anniversary for the first several years. In fact, it wasn't until 1963 that Academy officials determined that 1 April was in fact the anniversary. A front-page story by Staff Sergeant Bill Holland in the 25 March 1963 issue of the Academy's newspaper, The Falcon News, relates the story. Quote, "It has long perplexed even the most informed Academyite as to the exact origin date of this command. It could well be 10 years old, or even 8, depending on the criteria used. At last, the problem has been resolved with the announcement that officially, the West Point of the Air Force will observe its first official birthday April 1st, end of quote. The article goes on to say, quote, "Baffling as it may seem, the first class of cadets entered on July 11th, 1955, and to many this seemed like the logical date that future anniversaries would be celebrated. Not so. There were legion who believed that the date President Dwight Eisenhower signed legislation authorizing establishment of an Air Force Academy would eventually be accepted as the so-called official anniversary date. This theory, after considerable time, has been proven valid," end of quote. So there you have it, the story of the events that led to the establishment of the United States Air Force Academy and how we got Founders Day. This has been a somewhat unique episode of the Heritage Minute Special Podcast. I'm your host, Lieutenant Colonel Retired Steve Simon. Thank you so much for listening.
You've been listening to a Heritage Minute Special with Lieutenant Colonel Retired Steve Simon, USAFA Class of 77. The Heritage Minute Special is a production of the Long Blue Line Podcast Network and presented by the U.S. Air Force Academy Association and Foundation.